Let's talk pot. A CBS News poll says that nearly 2/3 of Americans support marijuana legalization. 65% of Americans are now in favor of the move. That's up from 59% at this point last year, and 45% just about 6 years ago. From a political standpoint, most Americans say it wouldn't make a difference if a presidential candidate supported marijuana legalization. 21% say they're more likely to vote for a candidate who supports it. 21% say they're less likely. Nevertheless, most 2020 presidential hopefuls are in favor of legalization in some form or another. The support comes from both progressives and moderates. President Trump has also noted his support for states to decide what they want to do. Earlier, my colleague Alex Dennis spoke to Mona Zhang. She's editor of Word on the Tree. They talked about how 2020 Democratic stances on marijuana differ.
I mean, they're all pretty much for legalization. This is the real first presidential election you're seeing where so many candidates are talking about this issue so openly and saying that they support legalization on the federal level.
Have any candidates previously introduced marijuana legalization?
Yeah, so Cory Booker has introduced one of the most comprehensive cannabis legalization bills to Congress to date. It's called the Marijuana Justice Act, and it not only removes marijuana from the controlled substances list, but it also contains criminal justice reforms, things like record expungement. It has a community reinvestment fund that would go towards communities that have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. So you're really seeing the conversation shift from, should we legalize it, to how do we legalize it and how do we remedy the impacts of the war on drugs. Elizabeth Warren has also introduced legislation that would protect states from federal enforcement and set their own cannabis policies.
So we're seeing that an increasing number of Americans support marijuana legalization, really across all ages. It's even the first time a majority of Republicans have now supported legalization in a CBS News poll that we had here. So do you think that this has caused a significant shift? What has caused that shift?
I think you've seen societal attitudes towards marijuana policy shift tremendously, in large part because so many states have legalized it. And I think voters see, well, Colorado legalized it years ago and the sky hasn't fallen and there's nothing terrible happening in society because there's a cannabis dispensary down the street. So there's this societal shift, and also the voting public tends to be ahead of policymakers on this issue. So I think this push is largely, from the voters pressing lawmakers to become more liberal on the issue.
I want to ask you something as it pertains to veterans. A lot of people are saying that the medicinal marijuana component is something that they would like veterans to be able to have access to, but they can't because it is still a Scheduled I drug. So are the Democrats saying that this is something that they support, even medicinal, if they don't support it in its entirety?
Yes, and I think the veterans issue is one that has very strong bipartisan support. You're not going to find very many conservative lawmakers saying that they don't think veterans should have access to this medicine. It is an issue that highlights the federal-state conflict of law, because even if a veteran lives in a state where cannabis is legal, they risk losing their VA benefits if they consume medical marijuana. Their VA doctors aren't allowed to recommend medical marijuana to them. So this really gets down to the federal-state conflict.
Interesting. So we're finding that a majority of Americans, really on both sides of the aisle, are saying that it makes no difference, to them about the presidential candidates, whether or not they support marijuana legalization. So why would you say Democrats so actively are eager to do so?
I think because the issue has such strong support from the voting public, and even though marijuana reform and drug policy reform in general is a low salience issue for voters, it does turn out voters, especially if it's on a state ballot. So, it could have a big impact on the presidential election. Say, for example, if Florida has a ballot initiative to legalize recreational marijuana, that could draw out a lot of young voters, it could draw a lot of left-leaning voters, and that could make a difference in a general election.
Do you find, or do you think that this is going to be a major issue in the 2020 campaign, even though we're seeing that 50% of Americans are saying this isn't really something that is going to sway them one way or the other from a candidate?
I think it is going to be a big issue, just partially because of the criminal justice elements of the marijuana legalization debate, and also because it is just something that enjoys such large support from the public. I mean, it doesn't look great for a Democratic candidate to oppose something like legalization, which is something that upwards of 60% of Americans support at this point.
All right, Mona Zhang, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.